Well, good day, everyone. So glad that you're here. I'm going to give everybody a minute to join us. And if you've been with me before, I'm so glad that you're back. If you've never been here before, I'm glad you're here. And we are going to, in a few minutes, kick off what will eventually become another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. But right now, of course, we're here live, whether you're on Facebook or you're here on YouTube or you're here on, LinkedIn. What I'd love for you to do first is to just open up the comments, say hello, tell us where you're from. We'd love to know that. And while you're here, I hope that you just imagine joining our guest, David York, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, and I for a cup of coffee. He's drinking coffee. I'm drinking tea. I just want you to imagine joining us for that and share your questions and your comments and your ideas, because we want your input and your questions as well. I hope that you'll do that as we go, right? And so when you do that, we'll have a better conversation. Eventually, we'll have a better podcast episode. So what I'm going to do now is, for the purposes of the podcast, I'm going to count down, and that's where we'll actually start the podcast. So thanks so much for being here. I'm glad that you're here. And again, use the comments throughout to ask your questions, share your comments, etc. And we'll share those with the world as well. We got folks from San Francisco and from Phoenix telling us so far, as well as Kat, who's in the mitten. And we will get started in 3, 2, 1. Would you like to make a bigger difference for your team, for your organization, for the world? Well, the solution for that is leadership, but it's more than just leadership. It's stewardship. And that is our topic today. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Many of you are saying, wait a minute, I'm not listening to this live. If you're listening to this podcast later, you could have joined us live, and you can certainly do that for future episodes on your favorite social media channel. You can get all of those future episodes and interact with us and see these episodes sooner. In the case of today's, several months sooner. And you can do that by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. To get more information about that, just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Pretty straightforward. Our episode today is brought to you by Remarkable Masterclasses. Each masterclass is designed to help you become the remarkable leader and human you were born to be. Details on how to get on board for a specific skill. The most recent one is, as a leader, how to become a talent magnet, or to get discounts each month, can be found at remarkablemasterclass.com. And with that, let me introduce our guest, bring him online. There he is. Let me give you a formal introduction to David, and then we will dive in, everybody. Our guest today is David York. He is an attorney, a CPA, and the managing partner of the Salt Lake City law firm York, Howell, and Guyman, which was recognized in 2017 in the Inc. 5000 fastest growing privately held companies. He also is a sought after speaker and author of 3 books, including his latest, The Gift of Lift, which we're going to talk about today. That book comes out in June. So for those of you in the podcast, it's already out. For those of you with us live, it's coming very soon. David currently serves on the board of directors of Holding Out Help and Healing Nations. He lives in Salt Lake City with his wife, Mindy, and their 5 children. And he is our guest today. David, welcome. Glad to have you, sir.
Oh, I'm really glad to be here, and I've been looking forward to this all week.
So as I said earlier, before we actually went live for the podcast, we've got people with us so far from San Francisco and Phoenix and Michigan and Southampton, the United Kingdom, which also lets me tell all the rest of you, tell us where you're from. I hope that you'll do that if you're with us live. So David, there's a couple of questions that I ask pretty much every week, every time we do this. And one of them is to find out a little bit about your journey. So you're a lawyer and a CPA, and now you're writing books about topics that aren't normally lawyery or CPA-ish. So tell us about the journey that got you to this point, in short, that got you here.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I'm an attorney. I'm also a CPA. So I'm 2 of the most boring people in the world wrapped into one. And I tell people I know an awful lot about very little. And when I started estate planning, I really came from a more technical standpoint, right? I came thinking, what is estate planning? How do we accomplish it? And it wasn't too long before I started to see some of the issues and problems with approaching it from a structural standpoint, right? Especially among higher net worth families inside of closely held businesses. I started to see a lot of issues and problems, and started to realize that the how and the what was secondary to the why and the who. And I saw so many people who struggled with the why of their wealth. They struggled with how that would affect and impact those around them. And I ended up dealing with a lot of people who knew how to become wealthy. They didn't know how to be wealthy. And they had such great intention and purpose in their businesses, and they had such a lack of that when it came to their wealth and their families.
So so that sort of sets the stage, and yet we're going to talk about this book, The Gift of Lift, which is really a book about stewardship. The subtitle of the book is Harnessing the Power of Stewardship to Elevate the World. And you open the book with a great story that I think you can tell me if I'm wrong, was the impetus for you getting on your journey to understand and explore stewardship. Would you mind sharing that story to start us out?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the origin story, right, of the book. So one of my clients, one of the people I've been fortunate enough to deal with for many years now is Gail Miller. She's one of the wealthiest women in the world, or at least in the U.S., and owner of, among other things, the Utah Jazz. So over the years, I've gotten to know her and work with her. And one of the things that she wanted to do was to ensure that the Jazz stayed inside the state of Utah for a long time, indefinitely. And if you've ever been to Utah, it's a great, beautiful state, but there's not necessarily a lot to do. So it's a really, really important part of our community. And so we were in the middle of working on a trust that would work to ensure that long-term it stay in our community. And as we were going over looking at some documents, and I just kind of asked her offhand, I said, how will it feel to no longer own the Jazz? And she looked back at me kind of matter-of-factly and said, well, I don't own the Jazz. And I kind of paused, because here I am, I'm her estate planning lawyer, and she's one of the brightest, sharpest people I know, at the time overseeing more than 70 different operating businesses. So, but I had to just pause and say, okay, actually you do own the Jazz. No, you technically do own the Jazz. And I'll never forget. So she stopped what she was doing and she looked at me and she said, no, I'm a steward of the Jazz. And it was honestly one of the most powerful professional moments of my life, because what I saw was someone who had transcended ownership. I think for many of us, we put the very top of the pyramid as ownership. And yet she was at a place beyond that. And so I sat back, and I've spent the last 6 years really thinking about, looking at, understanding and analyzing stewardship, and then finding other examples of stewards in the world.
So we shouldn't go any further, because that's a word that most of us have probably heard, but we may not know. Now, you've written a book about it, so we probably want to hear your definition of it. So you hear that from her, and you've gone on this sort of mental and intellectual journey about that word and what it means. So what does that mean to you? As we'll start to then unpack that as how it relates to all the rest of us.
Yeah, so as I started to look at that, and obviously stewardship has some different connotations. Sometimes you hear that in term from a financial standpoint. Oh, you need to be a good steward of your finances. Or you'll hear about it in the environmental movement, right? It's important to see the world in a stewardship mentality. But what is it? Well, at the end of the day, my definition of a steward is someone who's fully invested in something bigger than themselves. So at their core, they have two essential elements. That's investment and transcendence, right? They're all in. They're fully engaged. They invest their time, their talent, their treasure, but it's about something more than themselves. And that was the sense that I saw with her, because I knew she was all in, and yet it wasn't about her. And she was willing to hand over in the advancement of that transcendence, which was the best interest of the community, something that most of us would cling to the very last breath that we had, right?
I own the Jazz.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. I mean, there's only 30 of them. And when you see how much people are willing to pay for them, it's ultimately not an economic investment as much as it's about that ownership. And yet she was beyond that.
So, just for any of those who are here who might not be sports fans, or we know that there are people that they're listening that aren't in the U.S. Utah Jazz is one of the 30 NBA National Basketball Association franchises, and Salt Lake is a small market. That's what they would call it, right? Meaning that oftentimes what happens is when they get sold, they get moved. So I'm giving a little more context to what you've already shared, David, and what you're saying is she was past that piece, and as a sports fan, watching much of this from afar in general, I think you find that oftentimes those who are owning professional teams and wherever they are, as very much an ego play. So this is quite the opposite of that. Not just about the dollars, right? But the opposite of the purpose of it.
Yeah, and I actually think that's one of because we talk about the positive benefits of stewardship, but what's the opposite of a steward? Someone who has no investment in nothing bigger than themselves, and I call those consumers. And unfortunately, we see consumerism and the effects of consumerism in our lives, in our culture, in our societies, and we see the problems with it. And one of the problems with even just ownership is that if we're not careful, everything we own owns us back. And it can be insidious and we don't even realize it. But we can actually become slaves to what we think we own because it demands so much from us.
It makes me think, and this is a silly example, it makes me think of people that can't wait to buy a boat, and then after they've got a boat, they're like, holy smokes. I don't own a boat, so I can say that. So I want to ask another, I think, really important question. Okay, so here's what stewardship is, right? Focused on something bigger than ourselves. I get that. The question then is, why does that matter? Like, okay, some people see things that way. David, why does that matter? Why should we all be thinking about this? Why does it matter to us?
Yeah, it's because our mindset ends us up in a destination. It ends us up at a place. And again, oftentimes we can be so intentional at work, we can be so intentional in business, and then at home, it's the tyranny of the urgent, right? It's you gotta run the kids around, you gotta go to the grocery store, you've got to prepare homework and chores and all of those things. And so if we're not careful, that lack of intentionality or that lack of engagement can create a whole bunch of issues and problems. And at the same time, it's a far more impactful, engaging, and powerful way to live when you're all in, but it's not about you.
So an interesting point, right? Because the subtitle of the book says to do this to elevate the world, and yet your answer just now was to really elevate ourselves. So stewardship is one of those magical things that said everybody wins scenario if we see it right. You want to comment to that?
No, I totally agree, and that's kind of the counterintuitive part of it. Is when you focus on others, it does a couple of things, and when you focus on something that's bigger than yourself, first, it actually takes a lot of the pressure in life off. Because, so much of us live in what I call an if-then mindset, right? If I do this, then this will happen. If I work hard, then I'll get the promotion. If I grow the business to $10 million and sell it, then I'll be happy, right? But it's all about expectations, and it's all about ourselves. One of the big things that I see in the lives of stewards is they operate on a different mindset. It's what I call a because, therefore. So because of that thing that is transcendent, because of my why, therefore I will do this. And unlike expectations, you really only have two things that can happen with expectations. They can be met or they cannot be met, right? So if they're met,
it's pretty much black or white.
Exactly. You know, how happy are you when your expectations are met, right? But when they're not met, then it leads to frustration or anger or depression or anxiety or whatnot. But when it's a because therefore, you're not about a destination, you're about a direction, and you're about advancing the ball. And paradoxically, that knowledge that you're never actually going to reach your destination takes some of the pressure off. It's about advancing that thing that's bigger than yourself.
I would go as far as to say, and I was going to save this, but I think I'm going to say it now. I would go as far as to say, I will say this for me, that and we can have, and again, I'll make a comment, and feel free to say, Kevin, you got it all wrong. That I think that many people have probably had moments or situations when they've been stewards. Mm-hmm. And to the degree that you agree with that, and it looks like you do by the nodding, then I would just encourage people to think about those times based on what you've heard from David so far and say, how has it been? How has it felt? How has your life been impacted by those moments? And I can think of 3 or 4 of them, and I don't need to share them here. It's not the point. But I can tell you that in all of those, I guess it's a totally different situation for me, and really the outcomes as well. So you want to say any more? Again, not everyone, the people that are on the podcast are likely only hearing this, so they don't see you nodding with me. So go ahead and add to that.
No, I think that's right. You know, it's interesting. We all think back to our college psychology classes that we think of, and we think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You know, the old pyramid, and we think that the top is self-actualization, right? Achieving all that you want to achieve. But actually, Maslow had something that was higher than self-actualization, and he called it self-transcendence. And it's not freedom for yourself, it's actually freedom from yourself. And he actually saw that as a higher state of being, really. And when you think about it, it's more like the horizon. So often in life, we get bumped around and tossed around and everything else. But when we can look to the horizon, what's out there beyond us, it actually is a stabilizing force. Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, he talked about the twin virtues of freedom and responsibility. He actually, and I love this idea, and I know there have been people who've worked on this concept, but on the East Coast, obviously we have the Statue of Liberty, and it's all about freedom, and it's all about liberty for ourselves. He wanted to create on the West Coast what he called the Statue of Responsibility, because he really felt like it's important to pair those two together. But again, here you see that those two concepts. The freedom is that transcendence, it's that thing that's bigger, but responsibility is our engagement with that bigger thing. And it really takes both.
It's interesting, David, in the 7 or 8 or 10 minutes that you and I chatted before I hit the let's go live button, that's sort of what we talked about. We didn't use those words, but that's a big part about what you and I talked about. And I really love that. One of the things that you talk about in the book, and by the way, everybody, if you don't know Viktor Frankl, you need to read Man's Search for Meaning, which is the classic book that he wrote after he came out of the internment camps as a Jew during the Nazi time. And so Man's Search for Meaning should be on your reading list. Just saying. So you talk in the book about 4 destinations, and we've sort of talked about a couple of them. You've hinted at them. But what I want to have you do is talk about them, because you've now given us a picture of what stewardship is. And again, you've mentioned a couple of the other ones in this connection between transcendence and investment. But talk about all 4 of them just a little bit, or put the other 3 in context with stewardship, if you would.
Yeah, so let's look at the antithesis of stewardship, and that's consumerism. And those are people who there's no engagement, no personal engagement, and there's nothing bigger than themselves. That is why I think that the average American inheritance lasts 18 months. So if you think about what you acquire and build over the course of your life is on average consumed by the next generation in 18 months. Well, why is that? It's because we give them money that they didn't earn. We give no meaning and purpose behind it, and we have something that costs them nothing, and then we're shocked when it's not valued. And unfortunately, we see that. In 25 years of doing estate planning, the one thing I've learned is that we value things based on what they cost us. And when something doesn't cost us anything, we just simply cannot value it like something that comes with cost. But then you have dreamers. Dreamers are those who they are about something bigger than themselves. They are driven by meaning and engagement, and that's where I'm sure all of us have felt that sense of trying to make the world a better place. Right? The issue for dreamers is that they either lack the ability to invest because they just don't have resources, and we all have time, we all have talent, but they literally just have the inability, or they have the unwillingness to engage, right? They won't pay the price to live those dreams. Or here's to me the most tragic, they've never been asked. And unfortunately, I see that a lot, especially in high net worth families. A lot of my clients are wealth creators, and they earn their wealth through what? Hard work, risk, stress, sleepless nights, worry, right? It costs them a lot. Part of what they see is the benefit of that wealth is to help their kids avoid what? Hard work, risk, stress, sleepless nights. And what they don't realize is what they're trying to do as a benefit is actually undercutting the value. And so
freedom, no responsibility. Right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's interesting when you have freedom and you have no responsibility. What do we call that? That's actually entitlement. And you hear that word in estate planning a lot. I push back a little on it because I think we all have a sense of entitlement. We all have rights that we believe in, right? But to your point, when it's in the absence of responsibility, that's when the issues come. When you only have responsibility and you don't have rights, that's enslavement. And you really need a balance of the two. But then you have the owners, and those are people who are all in. I mean, these are the women and the men who are fully engaged, fully invested. But it's not about something bigger than themselves. And for them, unfortunately, it comes to an end, right? The kids move out. How many just super engaged stay-at-home parents are there that are all about the kids, and then suddenly the kids are gone, and there's nothing beyond that. The business is sold. There's a study I saw the other day that said 70% of business owners regret selling their business because they were on an if-then. If I build this business and I sell it, then I'll be happy. And but the business was their identity. There was nothing bigger than that. And when they lost the business, they lost their purpose. And so it's about the balance of those two. And that's where I find stewards are the most intentioned, the most at peace people. It doesn't mean it's an easy life, but it's certainly the most meaningful.
It's interesting because, and then one of the reasons I wanted you to unpack all the other three destinations or mindsets is in part because it helps us better understand the one we're talking about, which is stewardship. But the other reason that I wanted us to talk about that is that so many of us, and I'm going to say us, listening and watching, we want our, as a leader, we want our teams to take ownership. We want people to have ownership. But what we really want is for them to, ultimately, what we want them is to have a sense of ownership and a clear reason why. In our business, we talk about commercial and missional success, right? That both of them matter. And it's getting at that bigger why, which is sort of where you're headed with a lot of this conversation, which I really love. And so as great as ownership is, right, there's still something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I had a great example of this back when you could travel and go around the world and enjoy your life.
Hey, we're there again. We're getting there.
Yep, we're getting there. But in 2019, my whole family, we went to Italy, and we got to tour a fifth generation winery. We've been in business for 120 years, just outside of Verona, Italy. Just beautiful. And so I was talking with the daughter who was running the business, raising the sixth generation there, and I said, what is the secret of a 5-generation winery? I mean, survived world wars, survived all of these different things. And she said, it's one word. And I'm just kind of taken aback. Okay, well, what's that word? I'm brainstorming. And she said that word is passion. But then she described it in a way that I'll never forget. She said, it's a beautiful work, but it's also very hard. You have to look up and see the beauty and then look down and do the work. And in there, you hear, again, that stewardship, right? For them, the beauty was the transcendence. That's what they were all about. But if they weren't all in, fully engaged, working that land, they would not be sustainable. But they were about purpose, not profits. But that purpose led to the passion, led to the work, led to the profits, right? So they were about why and who, and that led to the what and the how.
Look up to see the beauty, look down to see the work, man. David, there's always at least one thing in every one of these episodes, and I told you how many of these we've done, that blesses me. That's it right there. And you also know that I grew up on a farm, and so it especially connects for me. So thank you for that. So stewardship and leadership, what's the connection or the connective tissue? And then I've got a follow-up related question, but what's the connective tissue between stewardship and leadership?
Yeah, so stewardship presents itself in a couple of unique ways in terms of leadership. Again, as I mentioned it before, they're all about the why. They have clarity of purpose, and that leads to direction. And the other thing that's great about purpose is it actually helps you to draw others who have that similar purpose, right? And so at the Caperso Winery in outside Verona, all the people who work there also see the beauty, right? And so it actually helps you to draw like-minded, intentioned people to do that. But the other thing I will say is, and this is a very unique element of a steward leader, they care more about their successors than they do about their success. So they're always looking forward. They have a foot in the present and a foot in the future. They see the world as it should be, they see the world as it is, and they look to connect those two things together. A lot of leaders, they live in today. They're not looking to the future. They're not building that next generation leader, and that's why they don't last. Even within family businesses, 70% of family businesses want to transition to the next generation, only 30% do. And it's because they don't develop that next generation because they're owners. The business is them. And then something happens to them and it dies. And so they have a really unique perspective of both present and future, and they see them both simultaneously. So that's one of the biggest. And then the other thing I will say is we try to seek balance. You know, you hear the word balance so much in life. Oh, we need more balance, right? Work-life balance. What stewards seek is counterbalance. And in other words, what they do is they let that purpose, that vision, drive that engagement. That engagement actually advances that purpose, and the two of them work so well together. Because balance is all about more or less. Oh, I need to work more. I need to work less. I need to exercise more or less. Instead of saying it's about the purpose and it's about advancing that. I kind of give the example of justice and mercy. If we're not careful, we see those as opposing forces, right? Oh, am I going to be just? Am I going to be merciful? But if I were to ask you, would you rather live in a world of justice and no mercy, or in a world of mercy and no justice? What would you pick? Personally, those both sound horrible.
Yeah, exactly. I want the merge of the both.
Yeah. And there's nothing that, if you want to draw out the best of justice, add mercy. You want to fully understand mercy, complete justice, right? And so some of these things that we think are opposing forces, actually opposing forces can actually bring more strength if we balance them, if we counterbalance them, as opposed to just trying to titrate everything up or down.
So we've talked about if, then, and because, therefore, and I'll add both and.
Yeah.
Right, to your point.
Yeah, really good.
So okay. We've talked about how it's connected to leadership, and after all, this is the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and yet all of us are also human, right? And not everyone has. There's positional leadership, and then there's people following us, which is true leadership, right? So my question then is, we've talked about how leadership and stewardship are connected. How are they disconnected? In other words, is stewardship only a concept for those leading, or not?
No, I think it's an example for anyone. Obviously, I look at different examples through human history, and there's some obviously well-known names that stand out. I think Nelson Mandela was a great example of a steward. He was actually offered his freedom 6 times. He could have walked out of jail, and he never did it because every time it was conditional. And for him, he wasn't fully free, which is what he was. He was about freedom for everyone, not just freedom for himself. But I see it in every day. Yeah, like I said, it could be in how you parent. It could be in how you work. It could be how you engage in organizations. It's a mindset, and it's that why that drives the how. And so I think it's the critical element is understanding what is that thing that's bigger than you, and then how am I going to engage in it?
It's interesting, the Mandela example. I was reading a book last evening called In the Arena. The publisher sent it to us to possibly have it on the podcast. And here's the framework of the book. It's a short piece about every person who ran for a U.S. president that lost. Now, if they eventually won, there's not a chapter. So, like, there's not a chapter for Richard Nixon because even though he lost, he did win. And they were talking about John McCain, the piece about John McCain. And I don't know that I realized this, because his dad was an admiral, and when they found him, they were going to let him go, using it as a PR stunt. We let go this dude, and he said, "I'm not going until everyone in front of me in the line is going." So one of the reasons that John McCain's there 5 years is, you talk about justice and mercy.
Yeah. You
talk about the big picture. You talk about freedom and responsibility. All that connected for me as well. So, I want to get to a couple other things that I'd like to ask everybody before we go. But one last thing. Is there anything we haven't talked about, David, that you think we should have, or something that maybe you wish I'd asked that I didn't?
No, I think we were talking about this a little bit beforehand, but I do think it takes some intentionality, some time. You just sit back, ask yourself. Part of my book is just questions. I'm not here to tell you what's bigger than yourself. That's something that is part of discovery. But, I think we're too much of our society, we're in the information age. So we're like, I just need one more piece of information. If I just listen, no offense, to one more podcast, then I'll have all the knowledge I need in life, right? I think data and information inform. I think questions and stories transform. And I think in a world where we have more data than we've ever had, more people who don't have any clue of who they are, what they value, and what they believe. And I think if you want to have a life of a steward, you need to know the answer to those questions. And that takes time. It takes self-reflection. It probably takes sitting down with some others. So that's why I put together a whole bunch of questions to help people understand that. And then I think everything else can flow from that.
We're talking with David York, the author of the brand new book, The Gift of Lift, and it is full of questions. Some of my marks are places where there are questions. Couple of questions for you, sir. More questions before we go. And the first one is totally changing the shifting the focus now, right? What do you do for fun, David?
Oh, I love to travel, and I love to bike ride. And my favorite thing to do is to bike ride while traveling. My wife and I, we love biking together. We even have these our helmets have headsets in them so we can chat while we bike along. And so definitely that's my, we've been watching the weather for a week so that make sure we have our bike ride tomorrow. But that's what we love doing. It's just talking and moving.
Both and, everybody.
Yeah.
So the only thing you knew I was going to ask you, David, is what are you reading these days? What are you reading, or you've recently read? We've obviously already mentioned a book that we both read, which is Man's Search for Meaning. But what are you reading now?
Yeah. To me, the best books that you read are the ones that as soon as you're done, you start rereading it again. And for me, that was Think Again by Adam Grant. Such a good book and such a timely book for us because we are so sure of what we know, and so much of what we know is wrong. And he does a really good job in that book of just laying out what I think is one of the key elements of growth and communication and relationship, and that's just humility. We live in a world that lacks. I always say humility is one of my 12 greatest qualities, right? But we live in a world that just lacks humility, and as a result, I think we miss out on questions that can actually lead us to learning.
So as we're here live, so thank you for that. Great book. I love that recommendation. And if you turn around, I'll pat you on the back to help you with that humility piece. But the thing that I do want you to be able to tell us about your book and your work. So where do you want to point people? Where can we learn more about you? If they want to get connected with you, where can they go? Where do you recommend? And again, if people are live, the book isn't out yet, but they can pre-order it. Where do you want to point people?
Yeah, so the book is available now for pre-order, or if you're listening later, it's up there. It's on all the normal Amazon, Kindle. We're working on an Audible version that should be out in time. But you can also go to davidryork.com. It's got a link to the TED Talk I gave on wealth, what wealth really is. It's got some articles and other things on there. So that's probably the best place.
davidryork.com. I've got it up here. If you're watching, you can see it. So I got it right, davidryork.com. So thanks for that. Thanks so much, David, for being here. Now I have a question for all of you who are here, and it's the most important two-word question I could ask you right now, and that is, now what? What are you going to do with this? What insight did you get is a fine question, but a better question is, what are you going to do with it? What action are you going to take? What insight will you apply? And I've got a ton of notes here. And so I'm not going to, much as David said a few minutes ago, I'm not going to presume what yours should be, but maybe it's something about finding and thinking about some of the questions that we've talked about. Maybe it's challenging and thinking about the idea of what it means to be a steward and when have I been one. Maybe it's thinking about transcendence versus investment. It could be any number of things that we talked about. It could be thinking about how you apply this in different parts of your life. You may have come to this podcast thinking work, leadership, and maybe you leave thinking about how this applies to other parts of your life. I don't know what it is, but what I do know is if you don't take this to heart and take action on it, it won't have been nearly as valuable as it can be. It really gets at this idea of turning it into transformation and not just having it be information, David, as you said a few minutes ago. So David, thank you so much for being here. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Always fun talking about this. It leaves you always a little bit more inspired.
And I hope that that's happened for all of you, whether it's this week or next week or last week. So if this is your first time here, you can certainly go back. There's plenty of great stuff in the archives. And we'll have in the show notes some other episodes that are sort of connected to this content that might make a great next step for you. If you've been here before, we'll be back. And if you've been here before and you like it, why don't you invite someone to join you in the future for the next episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.